There exists a psychological pattern rarely named but instantly recognized by those who carry it, the experience of living under permanent accusation. Not external accusation, though that may have been the origin. Something internal, a court that convenes without being called, a trial that runs without charges being read, a verdict that was delivered before the defendant could speak. This is not anxiety, though it produces anxiety, not perfectionism, though it drives perfectionist behavior, not low self-esteem, though it erodes confidence. It is something more fundamental, an entire judicial architecture installed in the psyche, complete with prosecutor, judge, jury, and defendant, all played by the same person. The person living this pattern knows it intimately. They are preparing testimony while driving, rehearsing defenses while showering, delivering closing statements to empty rooms at 3 a.m. Every silence from another person becomes evidence. Every ambiguous text becomes a summons. Every "we need to talk" triggers not a conversation but a trial, one that exhausts them before the actual exchange begins. What makes this pattern particularly insidious for deep intuitives, those whose minds naturally perceive beneath surfaces, who read subtext others miss, who sense shifts in emotional weather before anyone names them, is that the very gifts that could liberate them have been conscripted into defense work. Their perception doesn't explore, it scans for threat. Their depth doesn't create, it builds cases. Their sensitivity doesn't connect, it gathers evidence. This podcast proposes something that may initially seem counterintuitive. The trial is not the problem. The verdict is. And the verdict was delivered long before the person developed the capacity to question the court's authority. I recently explored this pattern in a video examining how it manifests in daily life. The exhaustion, the over-explanation, the impossible oscillation between not enough and too much. What follows goes deeper, into the historical and archetypal foundations of the inner tribunal, the shadow figure most never examine, and a practice for completion that video format cannot hold. Consider this the archaeological layer beneath that exploration. If you haven't watched the video yet, the link is in the description. 1. The trial is older than you think. The experience feels personal, a product of one's particular childhood, one's specific wounds, one's individual parents, and it is. But it is also something far older. The ancient Egyptians depicted the afterlife as a trial. In the Hall of Two Truths, the dead stood before 42 judges, while Anubis weighed their heart against the feather of Ma'at, a principle best understood as cosmic order, truth, balance, and right relationship. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, a demon devoured it. If it was light, the soul passed into eternity. Notice what they understood. The heart itself was the evidence, not words, not explanations, not carefully prepared defenses. The organ that held everything one had ever felt was placed on the scale, and it spoke whether one wanted it to or not. Imagine standing in that hall. One cannot argue, one cannot contextualize, one cannot explain that one was tired that day, or that they misunderstood, or that one meant well. The heart simply weighs what it weighs. The feather does not negotiate. This is what the inner court reaches for, a verdict that bypasses explanations entirely. And some part of those who carry this pattern has always known. The defense they keep preparing would not matter even if they could deliver it perfectly. The heart weighs what it weighs. The Judeo-Christian tradition carried this forward. The book of life, inscribed with every deed, the ledger being written as one lives, read back at the end. In these traditions, images of judgment often appear as a moral record of one's life, even though different schools understood this record in different ways. No editing, no explaining context. The record exists, and one will answer for it. These were not primitive superstitions. They were humanity's way of externalizing something it had always sensed, that across cultures we repeatedly imagine a court that never adjourns, that we carry an internal tribunal which weighs our actions, judges our worth, and delivers verdicts we feel in our bodies even when we cannot name them. Franz Kafka, who understood the modern psyche's particular torments better than almost anyone, wrote The Trial about a man named Joseph K., who wakes one morning to find himself accused. Of what? He is never told. By whom? Authorities he can never fully identify. He spends the entire novel trying to defend himself against charges he cannot know, in a court whose rules he cannot learn, before judges he cannot see. The novel ends with Joseph K. still not knowing what he was accused of. He dies without ever understanding the case against him. The book was published posthumously and unfinished, Yet this ending is widely accepted as reflecting Kafka's intent. Kafka was not writing fiction, he was writing diagnosis. This inheritance matters. One did not invent the inner court. One inherited a very old structure that got filled with very specific content. The architecture is ancient. The accusations are personal. 2. The prosecutor you have never faced. In the video, the focus falls on the defendant's experience, the exhaustion, the endless preparation of testimony, the closing statements delivered to rooms that remain empty. But there is a figure in that courtroom most never examined directly. The prosecutor. One knows this voice. It sounds like conscience. It sounds like responsibility. It sounds like the mature part of oneself that holds oneself accountable. But listen more carefully. Conscience says, a mistake was made. Here is how to repair it. The prosecutor says, you are a mistake and the evidence is mounting. Conscience seeks correction. The prosecutor seeks conviction. This is what makes the shadow so difficult to work with. We expect it to look like our worst impulses. Rage, selfishness, cruelty. And sometimes it does. But it can also disguise itself as virtue, as responsibility, as the mature voice that holds oneself accountable. The prosecutor wears the robes of conscience. It speaks in the language of self-improvement. It says, I'm only trying to help you be better. I'm only pointing out what you need to work on. I'm the part of you that takes things seriously. And underneath that reasonable voice, you are guilty and I will prove it. In Jungian terms, this is the shadow operating in one of its most sophisticated forms. Not the monster under the bed. Not the obvious darkness one can identify and reject. Something far more insidious. A part of oneself that learned to attack before anyone else could. Consider the logic. If one was raised in an environment where criticism was constant, where judgment was the weather, where one could never be certain when the next accusation would land, what would be the smartest adaptation? To criticize oneself first, to judge oneself before they could, to build the case against oneself so thoroughly that when the external attack came, one was already prepared. One had already found every flaw they might notice. One had already convicted oneself of every crime they might charge. The prosecutor is not the enemy. It was the protector. A part of the psyche that said, if I can find everything wrong with you before they do, I can shield you from surprise. I can make sure you are never caught off guard by your own inadequacy. It saved one then. A child who could anticipate criticism had a few extra seconds to prepare, to adjust, to minimize damage. The prosecutor gave those seconds. It was a gift. But gifts given in childhood do not always serve the adult. The prosecutor does not know the trial conditions have changed. It does not know that one is no longer small, no longer dependent, no longer trapped in that house with those people. It keeps building cases for a court that technically no longer has jurisdiction. And here is what makes this so painful for deep intuitives specifically. Intuition is the prosecutor's primary tool. The same capacity that allows one to read subtext, sense what is unspoken, perceive patterns others miss. That is exactly what the prosecutor uses to find evidence. It turns the gift into a weapon aimed at oneself. One cannot defeat the prosecutor by building a better defense. One cannot out-argue it. It knows everything one knows. It has access to everything one has access to. The only way through is to recognize it for what it is, a protector that does not know the war is over. 3. The verdict that preceded the trial. Here is what most examinations of this pattern miss. The trial is not the problem. The verdict is. One was convicted before one could speak, before one could build a defense, before one could understand what was happening. The verdict? You are not enough. You are too much. You are wrong in some fundamental way, was delivered when one was too young to question the court's authority. This is why the pattern is so difficult to escape. One is not fighting for acquittal. One is not even really on trial. One is appealing a case that was closed years ago, perhaps decades ago, by judges who had no right to convict but did it anyway. And because the verdict came before language, before logic, before the adult mind existed, it lives in a place that arguments cannot reach. One can know intellectually that one was a child, that the judgment was unfair, that one's parents were projecting their own wounds. One can know this completely, and the next time someone's tone shifts slightly, the body will respond as if the verdict was just read again. Carl Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." He did not mean accepting one's strengths. That is easy. He meant accepting that one carries this verdict, that it shaped everything, that one has organized an entire life around either proving it wrong or hiding from its implications. Accepting oneself completely means accepting that this happened, not to excuse it, not to wallow in it, but to finally see it clearly. The verdict was real. It happened. It affected everything. And it was handed down by a court that had no legitimate authority over one's worth. Both are true. 4. The alchemy of the accused. If one has read this far, one might be waiting to be told how to fix this, how to heal, how to finally be free. That is not what this section offers. Not because there is no path forward, but because fixing is still the language of the court. Fix yourself so you can finally be acquitted. Heal so you can prove you are not damaged. Become whole so the verdict can be overturned. That is not liberation. That is a more sophisticated defense strategy. Instead, consider a different frame. In alchemical traditions, which Jung studied extensively because he recognized they were maps of psychological transformation, the work begins with what they called the prima materia, the first matter, the raw, dark, undifferentiated substance from which gold could eventually be made. The prima materia was not something pure or clean or already valuable. It was often described as waste, refuse, the thing everyone else throws away. The alchemists understood that transformation does not begin with what is already good. It begins with what has been rejected. The exhaustion, the hypervigilance, the decades of defending against accusations real and imagined, the relentless self-examination, the inability to rest. This is the prima materia, not because suffering is noble, not because pain automatically produces wisdom, but because one has been carrying this material for years, and it contains compressed energy. It contains everything learned in the courtroom, perception, depth, the capacity to sense what others miss. The tools developed to survive the trial are real tools. They simply have not been allowed to serve anything except defense. Consider what has been developed: the ability to read a room before anyone speaks, the capacity to sense shifts in emotional weather that others do not notice until the storm arrives, the relentless pattern recognition that shows what lies beneath surfaces, the depth of self-examination that most people never attempt. These are not symptoms of damage. They are capacities forged under pressure, the kind of pressure that turns raw matter into gold. What happens to this material, whether it stays raw or transforms into something else, is not entirely within one's control. The wounded healer does not typically decide to become a healer. The capacity emerges from having carried the wound long enough that it becomes a kind of knowledge. The alchemist does not choose transformation so much as submit to it, but what can be recognized is this: the material is real, the capacities are real, and they have been serving defense when they could be serving something else. 5. The closing statement you will never deliver. One practice, not from the video. One has been preparing testimony for an entire life, explanations for people who did not ask, defenses against accusations that were never made, closing statements for trials that existed only in one's mind. All that energy, all those words, circling endlessly because they had nowhere to go. Here is what to do. Write the final one. Write the closing statement one wishes one could deliver to everyone who ever doubted, judged, made one feel like one had to prove oneself. Parents, teachers, friends who did not understand, partners who left, the version of oneself that still believes the verdict. Write it completely. Hold nothing back. Make the case that has been building for decades. Put every piece of evidence on the table. Say everything rehearsed in the shower, in the car, in bed at 3 in the morning. Let it be as long as it needs to be. Let it contain everything. And then, this is the important part, do not send it to anyone. Do not perform it. Do not even save it. Burn it. Delete it. Let it go. Not because it was not true, not because one did not deserve to say it, but because the act of completion allows the psyche to release what was waiting to be expressed. The testimony was never really for them. It was energy trapped inside, circling endlessly because it had nowhere to land. One has been carrying an undelivered speech for years, perhaps for decades. The weight of it has shaped posture, breathing, the ability to rest. Put it down. The court does not adjourn when one wins. It adjourns when one stops showing up. The door. In the video, I said the doors were never locked. That is true, but something else needs to be added here, in this quieter space. The doors were never locked, but neither was the chair. One was never strapped in. There were no bailiffs forcing anyone to stay. One sat down because a child had no choice, and one kept sitting because no one said it was permitted to stand. The trial is not something happening to one. It is something one is still doing, not because one is weak, not because one is broken, but because the pattern is old and deep and it shaped everything before there were words for it. One can stand up. The prosecutor will object. The judge will look stern. The jury will seem to lean forward, waiting to see what happens. They are all oneself, every figure in that courtroom, the whole apparatus, which means one is the only person who can adjourn it. Thanks for listening.